Greetings. My name is Scott Kaufman. I'm professor of history as well as co-director of the Robert E. McNair Center for Government and History here at Francis Marion University. I would like to welcome you to Social Media and Politics, a symposium co-sponsored by the McNair Center and the Department of Mass Communication here at FMU. This symposium could not be more timely. I am not referring simply to the death yesterday that was announced of Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple, who helped revolutionize the way in which offline communication is done, not only in this country but around the world. We can see also how timely this is by looking at what's happening internationally and domestically. The Arab Spring and the Arab Summer continue, which have been driven at least in part by social media. Protests in Greece against the austerity measures in that country have been organized with the help of Facebook and Twitter, among others. Protests are having an impact worldwide, including this country. Anwar al-Awlaki, who used social media in an attempt to spread al-Qaeda's ideology worldwide, was killed last week in an airstrike in Yemen. And according to many analysts, his death has been a serious blow to al-Qaeda. The presidential campaign is well underway, and the candidates are using social media to get their message out. Within the past couple of weeks, Occupy Wall Street, a series of demonstrations that began in New York City, have spread nationwide thanks to social websites. Blogging has expanded, both in the US and abroad, and vlogging is beginning to take off. Social media has in short become part of our lives. It is used in numerous ways, both at home and abroad. To discuss the impact of social media domestically and internationally, we have with us a distinguished panel. I'll introduce each of them in alphabetical order, after which they'll give a presentation. We will then have time at the end of the presentations for questions. Closest to me is Jonathan M. Acuff. Dr. Acuff received his PhD in political science from the University of Washington in 2008 and is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Geography here at FMU. His research interests include international relations theory, security studies, state formation and dissolution, and culture and collective identity. Most recently, Dr. Acuff was the author of Social Networking Media and the Revolution That Wasn't, a realistic assessment of the revolutionary situation in Iran, published in Media, Power, and Politics in the Digital Age, the 2009 Presidential Election Uprising in Iran, edited by Yahya Kalampur. He is the editor of the forthcoming Routledge volume with Brent Steele, Theory and Application of the Generation in International Relations and Politics, and his work has also appeared in Totalitarian Movements and Political Religions, the International Studies Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Religion and Violence, and is forthcoming in International Political Sociology. Next to him is Mr. Sid Bedingfield, a visiting professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina. During his career in newspaper and television journalism, Mr. Bedingfield spent 20 years at CNN and served as executive vice president in charge of news programming. Since joining USC, he has published in such journals as American Journalism and Journalism History, and presented research at national conferences organized by the Institute for Policy Studies and the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications. He has been interviewed about politics and media by the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the website Politico, as well as several South Carolina newspapers and television outlets. Finally, Dr. Corey Dauber. Dr. Dauber received her PhD at Northwestern University and is associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Currently, she is the visiting research scholar at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on terrorist and insurgent media and information strategies, including their attempts to manipulate the Western press, with a particular focus on the use of new media and the internet, and their use of visual imagery as a key component of their online propaganda. The ultimate goal of her research is the development of effective responses to terrorist propaganda. After some discussion, we've decided that Mr. Bedingfield will go first. I know he has a PowerPoint presentation he would like to show, so let me get this set up for him.
Okay. As Scott mentioned, I spent almost 25 years in daily journalism, and now I'm in academia, and I'd like to draw on my experiences in both for my presentation. I'd like to look back at use presidential politics in the United States as a way of looking at the recent history of not only how politicians have used social media, but also the way political journalism has covered social media and in some ways enhanced its, the image we have of its importance and its impact in politics. And then at the end, I want to be presumptuous enough here to propose a research agenda that I think those in academia need to be pursuing to gain a greater understanding of the impact of social media on politics here in the United States. Change. One more. I want to start with this man. You may or may not know him. His name is Joe Trippi. And Joe Trippi was a Democratic political operative, had a long career, started in the 80s as a Kennedy guy, always working sort of as a mid-level political operative, never ran a presidential campaign before, was best known until 2003, was best known for pioneering the use of the 1-800 number to raise money for a politician. He used that in the insurgent campaign of Jerry Brown in 1992 against Bill Clinton. In 2003, however, change the slide, Trippi got famous. Trippi became the campaign manager for another insurgent candidate, Howard Dean, then the little-known governor of Vermont. Dean burst onto the scene as an anti-war candidate, an anti-Iraq war candidate. He strongly opposed the U.S. invasion in Iraq. Unlike Hillary Clinton and John Kerry and other Democratic heavyweights who supported the congressional resolution authorizing the war, Dean opposed it. And the anti-war, anti-Bush wing of the Democratic Party coalesced around Dean in 2003. And he came from nowhere to become a dominant player, a prominent player, really, in the 2003 race for the presidency, the 2003 jockeying for the 2004 race for the presidency. If you remember, Dean sort of famously stood up at a Democratic National Committee meeting in 2003 and said, you know, I represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And so in this way, he had, with his message, his anti-Bush, anti-war message, had sort of gathered the more left wing of the party and sort of the hardcore Democrats of the party who were uncomfortable with the more accommodationist view of the party leaders in Washington. Dean ran an insurgent campaign. He was the outsider, and he depended on a lot of young volunteer help. A lot of them were young technical nerds, essentially. And this is a scene from his internet war room, his computer war room. Joe Trippi did a very smart thing in that campaign. He listened to those 20 and 21-year-olds who were telling him, let's reach out using the internet. And they did. They used essentially at that time in 2003, it was essentially a blog. Nothing more than really a blog at the time. But it did allow interactivity with supporters. And they had a heavy online presence. They were able to sign up volunteers. And they used something called meetup.com. Anybody here remember meetup.com? Sort of short-lived, but meetup.com was a way that online you could reach out to like-minded people and establish meetings, face-to-face meetings in your area. All Dean supporters come to such and such bar or restaurant in, say, Seattle, and let's meet face-to-face and organize our efforts here on behalf of the candidate. And this became, he's very successful in doing that. By August of 2003, you can change it, Dean was getting great traction. He was attracting large crowds, cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, large turnout, surprising the political media, because they didn't expect him to do that well. And he began to get attention from political journalists. In political journalism, there's something called the invisible primary. And it happens usually in the year before. We're in one now, right now, as a matter of fact, before the real primaries and the real caucuses begin. And political journalists look for other metrics other than votes to decide who's doing well, who's winning during this invisible primary. And one of the ways they look at it is, of course, energy and enthusiasm of supporters and crowds like this. But also, change the slide, they look at it in terms of fundraising. who's raising the most money, quarterly reports on who's raising the most money. And Dean was beating everyone. And he was using his online media to raise money from small donors. And if you remember, I don't know if anyone remembers here, he was using almost kind of a reality show type format. They were using this baseball bat graphic, and they would set a deadline, and we need to raise so much money by this deadline. And as money was raised, the bat would begin to fill up with the red here you see here. And so they created a kind of game around it in which, okay, fill the bat by the deadline. The quarterly deadline's coming up. We need to make a good showing, fill the bat up. And they were very successful at doing that. He began to break records, actually, in terms of fundraising. This got more attention from political journalists, the main Washington political journalists who really have a large impact and influence on the larger coverage of the campaign. Change it. And this got a lot of attention for Joe Trippi. In fact, Joe Trippi, a man of no small ego really, became the sort of internet guru. I'm not sure if Joe Trippi, before 2002, 2003, I'm not sure he spent much time online, but certainly by 2003, he was the internet guru. And you saw pieces like this in the New Republic, Joe Trippi and the Dean campaign, Internet Revolution, the man who reinvented campaigning. And at the time, by late September, October of 2003, there was a sense that Dean had the nomination wrapped up. He was raising more money. He had all this enthusiasm. He had this new breakthrough online campaigning going full steam. Sense that he had it won entirely. But in early 2004, you can change it, the Dean campaign finally came into contact with real voters. The invisible campaign ended. He reached Iowa. And what happened? You can change it. The campaign collapsed. Dean finished third in Iowa. John Kerry came back from the dead and won 38% of the vote. Dean only won 18% of the vote there. Even though many of these young supporters who had rallied to his online cause showed up to volunteer in Iowa. But Iowans who were going to the polls, or to the caucuses rather, to actually vote, meeting with their neighbors to actually vote, were not particularly impressed, had decided that they thought John Kerry was the safer bet, more electable for all these reasons. The online campaign didn't deliver votes. Change the slide. Joe Trippi would say that Dean failed because he was really, Trippi would say that Dean was not really ready for prime time as a candidate, and that he failed because he really couldn't connect with voters when he actually got out there to try to expand beyond his sort of young base of supporters. If you remember, Dean was all about being the anti-Bush candidate. And there is a lot of debate about whether the online enthusiasm that was created was more of a myth, more of a sense of a myth perpetuated by media coverage than it was a real evidence of a broad-based campaign. But if you can flip the slide, Joe Trippi will tell you, and he did in his book, that in fact his campaign, while Dean wasn't the perfect candidate for that campaign, that type of campaign was going to change politics forever, and that online campaigning would revolutionize our politics, and it would give the citizen more input into government than they had ever had. He was especially hard on television. Television had ruined politics. Online was going to bring real people back into politics. And you can flip it here and see one of his quotes. He says, "There is only one tool, one platform, one medium that allows the American people to take their government back, and that's the internet." And flip it again. He said the Dean campaign was the opening salvo in a revolution, the sound of people turning off their television and embracing the only form of technology that allowed them to be involved again. Well, that may have been true, but it certainly didn't work out the way he wanted it to for Howard Dean in 2004. But we all know there was another candidate who emerged during that 2004 campaign, and it was Barack Obama. here seen at the 2004 Democratic National Convention in his famous speech, Obama, when he announced that he was going to run for president in 2007, he too embraced the online campaign. And he hired the man who had really set up the online operation at Dean. And it wasn't Joe Trippi, it was a 24-year-old named Joe Rospers, young man who was in that war room that I had on the slide earlier. And Joe Rospers set up a new media operation. But this was, 4 years later from the Dean campaign. You can flip the slide here, and of course, the tools were far more sophisticated by 2007. Rospers put together an operation, they called it mybo.com, myBarackObama.com, and it allowed supporters to connect, to trade videos with each other, to sign up and volunteer, and it got, again, a lot of attention from the press. A lot of attention. And if you'll flip it, when Obama, of course, won the nomination and won the presidency, once again, you had political journalism focusing on the power of the online media operation to propel Obama essentially from the back of the pack early in 2007 to actually win the presidency. Yes, they talked about his message of hope and change and a new face and his incredible powers of oratorial skills, but they mostly, or a lot of them, all talked about his online power. And they did things like, flip it, it led to stories like this. This was a national magazine called Fast Company, and it says, "The kid who made Obama president." Well, that's Chris Hughes. Chris Hughes was another 24-year-old who went to Harvard, was a friend of Mark Zuckerberg's, and worked with Mark Zuckerberg to create Facebook. He left Facebook in 2007 and came to become the new media, or the social media as it was now called, the social media guru of the Obama campaign. And so, okay, you have Facebook and you have Obama together. Well, for the media, this was just too much. This was too perfect. And again, I talk from experience here that, new faces, the promise of big change. Certainly the media just lapped this up. And you get things like the kid who made Obama president. Well, flip the slide and you'll see the professionals who ran the Obama campaign. I'm not sure they exactly agreed with that sort of interpretation of what happened that year. David Plouffe, in his book, certainly extols the virtue of social media and its power to connect and rally volunteers and get people involved with the campaign. But if you read closely, he talks about the difference when you're approaching Election Day, when you need people to move beyond simply liking something or even contributing small amounts of money. When you really need them to actually get out and go to the polls, social media played almost no role in that. It was face-to-face, old-fashioned, get-out-the-vote operations there. And he talks about that at length. And I had a friend who worked with me at CNN who went to work for Obama's new media operation, for Joe Rospers, young woman who did the video part of the new media operation at the Obama campaign. And she says internally, people like David Plouffe and David Axelrod and the other leaders of the campaign were quite amused by the political journalism's focus on this new media operation. They love it. They thought it did have a real impact. It certainly raised a lot of money, but they raised this question about, at the end of the day, message and getting people to the polls, getting them actually to, leave work to go vote, to actually vote, is something that required face-to-face interaction. Which, again, thinking about that led me to think about, you can flip the slide, I'm sorry. This idea of weak tie, strong tie networks. What is this telling us? Well, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a piece in the New Yorker that I think is interesting. And I call him the contrarian here because he takes a different view. Not to say that social media is not incredibly important in connecting people. It is an incredibly efficient way to bring people, to connect people, bring people together. But he makes the point that social networks driven by social media tend to be weak tie networks, more decentralized. They require, they don't ask a lot of the members. And he makes the analogy in looking at, say, the civil rights movement, where you had this strong tie network where people were risking their lives, or certainly were risking physical violence and damage. And the people, there have been studies that looked at in the civil rights movement in the 60s, those who volunteered and stayed, say, for all of the Mississippi summer of 1964, the ones who stayed were ones who had close associations with other members of the movement. It was much harder for them to break that association and actually drop out. The ones who left had weak ties. Gladwell makes the argument that social media is great at creating these weak tie networks, kind of decentralized, people move in and out of them, but maybe not so great at making strong tie networks, where you actually need to be at risk and actually contribute something that may be difficult to do to the operation. You can flip the slide. On the other side of that argument is what I call the evangelist, and that's Clay Shirky, who's written a book called Here Comes Everybody, which makes the exact opposite argument, that social media actually will create strong networks that are capable of doing amazing things. And Gladwell and Shirky sort of begin this argument that my colleagues here are going to take up a little bit about the role of social media in revolutions around the world. What role did they really play? Were they really as important as the media makes them out to be, or were they in fact simply another and maybe a more efficient and better communication tool? Because if you think about it, of course, the telephone was once an incredibly amazing communication tool for reaching out and gathering people and in politics. Is social media actually fundamentally changing the way networks and organizations are built, or is it simply a way of creating weak ties, and you still have to do the old-fashioned work of going face-to-face and really moving somebody to that strong tie position before you can really get an effective organization going? And if we'll flip the slide, I want to finish, as I say, I think this is a critical question that we're at. I think the media tends to hype a little bit, and I don't want to imply that social media, the tools of social media aren't extremely powerful. And they are changing politics, and they're changing almost everything in our society in fundamental ways. But their question about media coverage presenting a kind of outsized view of their power, of their ability to, for example, make Barack Obama president. And so I think there's a real area there of research. Do social media motivate political engagement, or are they merely tools used? Is there a difference between weak tie and strong tie? And how can that difference be measured when we're talking about an actual organization? And can weak tie networks actually be harnessed to generate strong tie activity? Could, and I'll end with this, Barack Obama, there was much made when he was elected about his massive email list, this whole social media network that he had created. He would change the way government worked by being able to mobilize this force out there, this, more than 10 million or whatever the number was, many million email list of these shock troops out there who were ready to rally behind him to carry out build support for his policy proposals. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. Policy proposals are complicated. They require a lot of knowledge about the policy. You have to debate people who certainly can make a strong case on the other side. Rallying those people to actually support him through the tough times of healthcare reform debate and into certainly stimulus, and while the economy is at a low ebb. He has those emails, he has that network. It hasn't really helped him in the policy debate so far. Certainly hasn't been an overwhelming factor. Weak tie, strong tie, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
So I will cast myself in good company, as Sid mentions, with Malcolm Gladwell as a skeptic of the potential impact of social media. But of course, one of the cool things about social media, media in general, is there are all sorts of fun nuggets out there on the web, if this will work. Here we go. So I pulled this up this morning. This is a backpacker's guide to the Arab Spring. The millennial generation's view of what just happened, basically. My particular favorite is the Borg over there in Iran. There's nothing on there, actually. I didn't look. There's anything on there that's going to get me in trouble with the FCC? I don't think so. All right. But that's, of course, one of the things rich about that most social medium is the web. So as I said, I'm going to pose some doubt, basically, as to the argument, essentially, that social media caused the Arab Spring, that social media can fundamentally reshape the way people are mobilized. Now, I say this as a social scientist, which is to say that I do not have a theocratic or religious commitment to this position. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. I think social media can be very important, but the way it's been treated by the media has been essentially that look at these new forms of communication, look how they do all these wonderful things. It's what I call in my own work technological utopianism. The belief essentially that much as Marshall McLuhan told us in the early 60s, that the new media makes the message, essentially, if I may riff off of him for a moment. So my own work in this subject matter is mostly focused on Iran. So I'll start with some choice nuggets from old media, since these are all basically print or video broadcast journalism, trying to describe, get their hands around what was happening in June, mid-June of 2009, right after Ahmadinejad and his cohorts had declared himself the winner of the Iranian presidential election 4 hours after the polls closed. Something that I dare say we could not accomplish in the more technologically minded United States, but somehow all the votes had been hand counted in Iran in 4 hours. This has put people in the streets almost immediately, and we saw sustained protests all the way into November of 2009, with people well into period we know as Thanksgiving, nightly shouting from the rooftops in Tehran, "Death to the dictator!" And instead of the traditional death to the dictator, which used to be us, the great Satan, they were referring to Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of the Guardians Council, and Ahmadinejad as well. So here's how we try to wrap our head around this. We've first described it by several media outlets, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, as the Twitter revolution, right? The more even bolder statement by Noah Shachtman, who is also, I believe, connected with Wired magazine, so he might have a dog in this fight, shall we say. Communication itself erodes despots' authority. Quite a bold claim, right? ABC News, excuse me, this is a political protest wrapped in a technological revolution. All right, this is a country that lives on text messaging. I thought that was us, actually. All right? So you'll notice we tend to see these things almost immediately, and I spent very little time leaving the house from about the 18th of June until about the 26th, 27th of June. All I did was watch TV and consume online media, trying to figure out what was going on in Iran. And this was like a drumbeat constantly, was this Twitter is doing it, Facebook is doing it, Twitter is doing it. And I mean, there's a pretty good argument for this. I mean, here's Facebook's global reach, which is astonishing for a company that is basically only 6 years old. As much as I hate to admit it, because I really don't particularly care for Mark Zuckerberg, more so after watching The Social Network, which I know is a work of fiction still. There's probably some artistic truth there. The kid's a genius. It is absolutely amazing what he has done with his corporation. And its global reach has certainly reached into the Middle East, which if you look at the middle right-hand section there, you can see that the political participation, the internet participation via Facebook of 18 to 25-year-olds is about 40% greater than our own. All right, so that is certainly a wired generation, without a doubt, in the Middle East. You can see his reach around the world is concentrated among young people, but the Middle East Facebook density is quite strong. These data are from the 10th of October 2010, so it's before the Arab Spring and after the 2009 protests. So I'm probably already out of date there. It's probably moved a little bit further since then. However, the Arab Spring, which of course began in January of 2011 in Tunisia, should remind us, if we're interested in looking at how social media have an effect upon revolutions and social movements, that there's good reason to doubt the conventional account provided by print media and some of the media evangelists themselves as to how powerful Facebook and Twitter are. Because if you look at the variation, that is, the countries that actually did have successful revolutions versus the countries that, well, frankly, have not had successful revolutions. Now, this is still a story unfolding because Syria is probably going to succeed at repressing its revolution, but we're still not sure about that. The UN actually posted today that more than 2,900 people have been killed by the government forces in the suppression of that revolt. Yemen, we're still not sure about that. A very confused situation. That might end up being a successful revolution. Hard to tell. But we're pretty sure about the rest of the cases. Apart from some very weak protests in Iraq, Morocco, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, nary a peep, really, from those protesters. Iran, there was an attempt to reproduce the 2009 revolution. It was brutally crushed very quickly by the Besieged militia with very little effort on the part of the regime. Bahrain, one of the places where you have the highest per capita Facebook and social media in general density in the Middle East. And they were crushed as well with the help of about 2,000 Saudi Arabian army soldiers. Algeria, similarly crushed as well. And if you look at the countries that had successful revolutions, that is Tunisia, of course, where all of this started in the Middle East, very wired country, very young population, very well educated, very well tied to social media. This is the ideal case for the argument that new social media are decisive in successful revolutions. Then you get to Egypt, much more mixed bag there. Right? In the urban areas, absolutely, it's much more wired, but there is a rural interior to Egypt as well. Right? Libya, one of the least wired countries in the Middle East, and the Libyan revolution seems pretty much to have been successful. The rebel forces still have not taken absolute control over Sirte, but they probably will in the near future. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff just is in Naples as we speak, discussing with the rebel army commanders exactly what else the NATO participating countries like ourselves and the French may do to help them basically mop up the situation. Right. So the problem with the basic thesis that social media is decisive is that in places where it should happen, like Bahrain, you don't get a successful revolution. And in places where we wouldn't really expect that revolution to be successful according to the social media thesis, the revolution is successful, Libya. So I think we can make an argument that social media as a cause of revolution may explain some revolutions, but as far as the entire Arab Spring, there's much more to this. So what does the argument look like regarding the efficacy of social media? I mean, what exactly are these people arguing? Well, one assertion might be that social media allows a tremendous speed or rapidity to them, allows communication that overwhelms the ability of leaders to react to that communication. And that certainly looks very plausible. The connectivity of Twitter, the connectivity of cell phone images, which can be immediately uploaded to Facebook, the amazing integration of these systems that is very easy for even relatively untutored people like myself to figure out. Certainly, that could contribute to very quick communication. But if you actually look what happened in the Arab Spring, most of the revolts in the Arab world were slow burns. Tunisia happened in about 3 weeks. Ben Ali, the president, left immediately, promptly suffering a stroke almost immediately after leaving the country. But Egypt took almost 2 months. All right? The operations in Libya took a really long time as well. Syria is still in progress. So the assertion that social media provides an overwhelming sort of rapidity of communication that allows people to mobilize so quickly that leaders can't respond is not entirely convincing with regard to the Arab Spring. One of the things, if you look at Egypt in particular, the protests ultimately were successful in Tahrir Square. But if you look at the first couple weeks, you had very quick mobilization, probably a lot of it from text messaging and from Facebook and other social media platforms. But one of the things that happened as well was that many of these protests were very promptly arrested by the security forces. And they were cloistered, put in jails, sequestered from their fellow protesters. And if you look at the pattern of what happened is that gradually over time, the police stopped holding these people and they stopped complying to the orders, if there were any orders generated from Mubarak. And the key variable here in the case of Egypt was Mubarak was very sick. All right, Mubarak went to Germany the previous year because he had, I believe, liver cancer. And so he's a very sick man, and not nearly what he was for the previous 29, 30 years of his rule. So it's very likely that the security forces were waiting for him and maybe his son Gamal to give decisive orders about what to do, and they never received those orders. So the police simply stopped complying. I'm not sure that social media really is part of that story because it allows for this rapidity, but the regime did respond initially. They did respond with coercive force. And then they sort of stopped and muddled around, and it wasn't entirely clear who was in charge, who was giving orders, until finally the regime basically collapsed and the army said, we're in charge. Right? And if you look more closely at Tunisia, it doesn't fit that model very exactly, but Ben Ali was not a healthy man either, and he gave up relatively quickly, and one wonders whether it's not because he was very, very old and he'd been in power for a really long time, so he was more vulnerable. Another possible argument from social media being very effective is that the new media spreads message regionally and globally, so you're able to tie in to like-minded people, similar educational backgrounds, similar ideological preferences, and it allows you to combine your resources and mobilize. And the case that is most cited in regard to this is the martyrdom of Mohammed Bouazizi, who was a shopkeeper, he ran a shop stand actually in Tunisia. And the government had instituted a set of regulations that basically drove him out of business. And he was ruined, and he was a family man. So he lit himself on fire, all right, in the ultimate act of protest to the regime. And that is really what started the Arab Spring in the Middle East. Now, let me see if I can actually click on this link, excuse me. Jeez Louise. However, anybody recognize this picture from 1963? All right, not the first time that someone has lit themselves on fire in an act of martyrdom. This is a Buddhist priest protesting the crackdown by the Catholic president of Vietnam, Diem, who was a Catholic himself, was severely repressing the Buddhists in the early 60s. And in an act of protest, this priest immolated himself in front of the international media. This appeared on the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, all over Europe's newspapers. Old print media. Diem was gone by November of that year, out of power in a coup that the United States basically gave a go-ahead. So I would suggest that even old media was capable of mobilizing globally and regionally people of similar ideological bent. The last sort of contention that social media advocates would suggest about social movements or revolutions is that new media allows people to organize more efficiently. And I think there's no denying this is clearly true. The resource costs for participating in social media are virtually zero. And the ability to mobilize people through these media is obviously very much more efficiently produced through these media. However, there's a flip side to this. As long as the networks are functioning, as long as the power is on, these systems will work. In the New York Times yesterday, the Times reported that Taliban forces in Afghanistan have pursued a new tactic. They have coerced these cell phone companies to shut down the cell networks from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. every single night, which allows the Taliban to execute its operations at night and prevents anyone from basically tattling on them to NATO forces. The way they've accomplished this is basically telling the cell companies, look, you like your cell phone towers? You want to keep your cell phone towers? You'll turn off your cell phone towers from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. And if you don't do that, we're going to blow up your cell phone towers. And it costs these companies about $500,000 US to repair the cell phone towers. Rather costly for the principle of providing constant cell service, yes? As a result, the Taliban can operate with not impunity, but certainly more flexibility. But this demonstrates to us the vulnerability that complex modern networks have to simple power outages, to interference with networks. If you look at the Syrian government, what it's been doing over the past couple of months, one of the things it has is when in towns where protests appear, they immediately shut off access to cell phone networks. They order the internet service providers, the ISPs, to shut down their servers so they can basically jam access to the web. And it is not as difficult as one might think, at least in a country like Syria. Certainly in the United States, where there's a lot of redundancy built into the system, where there's an enormous amount of bandwidth, that would probably be a lot more difficult. But in Syria, apparently, it's not as difficult as one might think. This has been very effective in repression. You could also look at the ability of the Chinese government to repress dissent. Chinese, extraordinarily cired population, very internet savvy, young people, increasingly well educated, highly urbanized as cities, as the population moves from the interior to the coast. Yet we have not seen protest movements in China recently on the scale that we've seen in the Arab Spring. And I suspect some of that is because the People's Liberation Army police have gotten very good at figuring out who's talking to who and which networks. It's a problem if you rely on a particular set of communications activities to mobilize. Yes, it's easy. You want to make open access to make sure everybody gets on board, but that also means some pretty nasty people who are pursuing what's called a false flag approach, who are really security personnel but pretend to be sympathetic to your cause. It's very easy for them to get involved, find out who everybody is in the network, and then send the bad guys to their doors. I would suspect the regime in Syria has been very successful at pursuing that strategy, and it's probable that the Chinese are doing that as well. So how might social media actually be causal? All right, how might it really matter? How can we improve a social media thesis? Well, it would have to address some of the issues I outlined above, I would think. Does social media increase the intensity of political grievances or associated emotions? Well, it can, right? Because the potential of video, the potential emotional impact of showing someone who is willing to burn themselves alive, that will put people in the streets. People are much more empathetic to see that sort of thing. And text, it's not just text alone, right? But really, does it actually amplify the grievances that existed before that? Well, not really. It's a medium, right? And medium don't necessarily carry intrinsic political interests. Another thing that social media, as a thesis, basically for revolutions and social mobilization, would probably have to engage is, do social media erode the material resources of the state to suppress protests? If they don't, and the state is well led, social media are not going to be causal in terms of revolutions, because the state will deploy its coercive apparatus and it will crush the revolt. But where it does, then it should matter. But it's also worth, in this context, comparing the ability of social media to mobilize people compared to traditional networks. And if you look at the work of Ben Smith at the University of Florida, who's a political scientist, and his work, his first book is about the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And what he did was basically walked around the bazaar in Tehran and other cities like Qom, and asked the people working in the bazaar, they're called bazaris, strangely enough, and asked them, you know, what were you doing in 78, 79? And it turned out that a lot of the groundswell of support for the return of Khomeini came out of these business networks in the bazaars. The bazaris worked together as a social network, right? Albeit without technology, and they were very effective in mobilizing that way. So in order for social media to be decisive in a successful revolution, it would have to supplant, be better, more effective than traditional networks. Certainly some cultures that will be true. Others, probably not. Lastly, revolutions are contests of will. You know, do social media affect the will of despots to resist? Maybe, okay? But I would suggest, if you look at the Arab Spring, at least as an exemplar, Mubarak wanted to stay in power, but he really didn't have, you know, the capacity any longer to rule like he had. Ben Ali probably wanted to stay in power, and he clearly didn't have the capacity to do that either. Bashar al-Assad really likes his job. He's not going anywhere. He will fight really, really hard to keep that job. Even Muammar Gaddafi, who keeps issuing statements from whatever hut, cave, trailer park that he's located in these days, he keeps issuing calls to his people to revolt and throw off their foreign oppressors. He really liked his job, apparently, too. Do social media actually affect the will of despots to resist? They might, but the thesis would have to be a little bit clearer. The argument from people who advocate the technological utopianism that I mentioned earlier, that this kind of medium can, these kind of media can change, you know, the dynamics, they would have to address exactly how this would happen in regard to will. And we can look at Egypt in 2008 as a perfect example of this, as a kind of what I'd call a counterfactual laboratory, what might have happened then, and compare it to what actually did happen, and say how things might have gone in a different direction. And that helps us look at what really is causal and what isn't. And even in 2008, you can see this quote from the Egyptian Mail, a newspaper in Cairo. Facebook is the stage for the latest twist in the generation gap, playing host to politically hungry young Egyptians eager to take on their aging leader. The interesting thing is that that statement wasn't actually written by a journalist in Egypt. It was written by a blogger in New York City and then sent to the paper and then reprinted completely, word for word. So you get the global connection thing that I was talking about earlier, that social media certainly can do that, and then put in old media to sort of demonstrate, look, something new is coming. The problem is, though, is that that call was clearly too soon, because on the 5th of May in 2008, the blogger community in Egypt called for a nationwide general strike and protests, and nothing happened. Nobody went on strike, nobody protested, they all stayed home. So one should ask, why was it successful in 2011, in January, February, March, all the way into April, even May? Why was it successful in mobilizing people then? And it wasn't successful in 2008, because clearly the attempt was made. There were protests in Egypt long before the Arab Spring, and very violent ones as well. In 2007, there were the Mahalla riots, where hundreds of people were arrested, dozens were hurt, and several were killed. You can see the regime security forces in plain clothes beating people during those riots. And those riots were organized by more conventional elements of Egyptian civil society. Unions, primarily garment workers who were very upset with a cut in subsidies and a decline in their wages that had been going on for years, as well as the Muslim Brotherhood, Egypt's only real opposition political party at the time. There were also riots in 2010 against the Christian minority, the Copts, who comprise about 10% of Egypt's population, over a rumor started by extremist Islamists that somehow the Copts were responsible for an alleged rape that occurred in a neighborhood in Cairo. This resulted in pretty severe violence between the Christian minority and the Muslim majority, as well as, unfortunately, the slaughter of 350,000 pigs, believe it or not, which was related to an outbreak of disease, but the slaughter was really to try to get at the Copts, essentially. What changed in 2011? Why did these initial social protests not generate anything? I would suggest the key here is that Mubarak was simply sicker. Right? He was not able to effect a crackdown the way he was the previous years. And his son, his alleged successor, was not somebody that the political elites were going to support. I'm not sure social media was decisive in this case. Moreover, in lots of different revolutions historically, we've claimed many times that the new media form generates the revolution. We did this in 1776. Thomas Paine, his pamphlet, put us in the streets, all right? Well, maybe they did, okay. In 1989 in Eastern Europe, the Samizdat, the photocopied books of Václav Havel and other resistors of the communist regimes were distributed clandestinely between people using photocopiers. And there was an assertion frequently by journalists and academics at that time that photocopier revolution was what was going on. The same year at Tiananmen Square, the brave kids in Tiananmen Square were sending faxes to Western journalists to try to generate global support. Strangely enough, in 1979, and even in Iran, there were claims by people that the Iranian Revolution there was fostered by these smuggled cassette tapes of the Ayatollah Khomeini's speeches in Paris, which were distributed to people. So there was an assertion there, this new media of the silicon tape basically was generating revolution. Well, we should ask really, in retrospect, is freedom really on the march in the Arab Spring? And here I'm reminded of one of the media skeptics of whether really you're putting bodies in the street because of Twitter, Clifford Bob, and he basically points out in 2005 that technology-driven social movements often, quote, run into the hard reality of life, of repression and life after the revolution. Because revolutions are not just about getting people in the street, successfully destroying the regime above you, the ancien regime as it's called in academia, but they're also about what happens next. All right, and the protests have continued off and on in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Certainly the protests have continued in Libya to the point where you've had a sort of proto-civil war. But we should also remind ourselves that revolutions will often fail. And the 2004 Orange Revolution was supposed to be a herald new democracy in Ukraine. It was going to throw out the cancerous Russian influence of Vladimir Putin and Medvedev. Actually, Ukraine is about as repressive as it's been even before, since the 2004 revolution. It's just who's in charge has changed. So that's something we should consider. Revolutions, they're complex events. There's a lot going on in them, and it's probably not the simple story of new media. Thanks.
President Carter, Dr. Waters, everyone at the Department of Mass Comm and the McNair Center, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to Florence and your beautiful campus and for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful and very timely event, which obviously has implications for all of us. I'd especially like to thank Professor Kaufman, who has truly gone above and beyond as far as being a gracious host is concerned. You know, deep down, Tar Heels always like to think that we have invented Southern hospitality. That's at least what we say whenever there are either Yankees or Dukies in the room. But obviously that's not the case, so thank you very much for everything that you've done. Now, I do need to formally say before anything else that these are my own opinions and not those of the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, U.S. Army War College, or the Strategic Studies Institute. Now, with all of that said, I thought that it was going to be my role for the evening to be, you know, the buzz kill, but apparently no one's really jumped on the social media bandwagon so far, so I guess I'm just going to be emphasizing the general tone of the evening. So, as wonderful as social media can be, and as enormous as its potential is, it's a tool. And like any other tool, it can be used either for good or for ill. The power of social media is what makes it attractive to people who want to use the web to persuade others. And not all of those people are interested in persuasion for benign purposes. When the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, Al-Qaeda lost its primary sanctuary in physical space along with most of its training camps. Over time, they have morphed from a terrorist organization to a social movement, and one that was as much virtual as physical, with the goal of reaching, radicalizing, and training individuals without ever necessarily meeting them offline, and of recruiting individuals online to get them to come to them for offline training. Al-Qaeda is not dead, it is different. So it is now a network of loosely affiliated groups, plus this online presence, what many analysts, you may have heard them refer to as Al-Qaeda 2.0. Now, Al-Qaeda 2.0 makes heavy use of a number of forms of social media. My own interest is in their propaganda videos, often posted to video sharing sites, including, believe it or not, YouTube. And all of the clips I'll be showing you tonight, by the way, are from videos that were not originally, but at some point posted to YouTube. The University of Arizona Dark Web Project, which sends what they call spidering or go fetch computer programs out into cyberspace to retrieve terrorist content, has already pulled in more than 500 million individual pieces of content. That's more than 1/2 billion pieces, and many, many more go up every day, just to give you a sense of the scope. Now, you probably recognize this fella, or you would if that stupid piece of malware wasn't there. This is Anwar al-Awlaki, and he's been in the news of late, of course, because we finally got him. Now, he was an operational leader involved in actual plots, but that's not the only reason he was a threat. He was very aggressive in the use of social media, and in his case it was videos, primarily taped sermons. And his specialty has been persuading Muslims living in the West to take up arms to engage in violence against their home countries. Remember, he was born in New Mexico, so he spoke flawless and essentially unaccented American English. The morning of his death, if you searched under his name on YouTube, you would have gotten 5,220 hits. That's in English. If you had typed his name into the search box in Arabic, you only would have gotten 89. That's fewer than 100. Obviously, that's not 5,000 discrete videos. That's reposts. That includes reposts, which give you a sense of his popularity and importance. Why is this guy so important? This is Major Nadal Hassan, otherwise known as the Fort Hood shooter. And before he walked onto the Army post where he was stationed and started firing at his fellow shooters, he had been in direct contact with al-Awlaki and was inspired by his videos. This is Faisal Shahzad, otherwise known as the Times Square bomber. And before he attempted to light up Lower Manhattan with a bomb, he had been inspired by the videos of al-Awlaki. Now, a case that received far less attention here in the States, but which received enormous attention in the UK, is this woman, Roshanara Chowdhury. She is a British subject of Bangladeshi heritage. And like a number of you here tonight, Roshanara was a college student. Perhaps like some of you, she was a comm major, had to be comm, and perhaps like some of you, she was at the very top of her class. Then, only a few weeks before the end of the school year, drops out of college. A few weeks after that, she went to a meeting with her MP, sort of the equivalent of a member of Congress town hall. She calmly pulls a knife out of her purse, and she starts stabbing the guy. By the time they pull her off of him, she had stabbed him repeatedly. It's sort of a miracle the guy survived. Excerpts of her interview with the police detectives after her arrest have been made public in the UK, and they caused quite a sensation. I want to read you just a little bit of this. So the cop says, "When did you make that decision to drop out of school?" "About a month ago." "It seems quite a long time to be there and almost to the end of that course and just let it go. Did you have problems understanding the course?" "I was the top student." "Was you? Okay, and what did they say when you pulled out?" "They didn't want me to pull out." "Tell me what happened today." "I stabbed Stephen Timms," that's the MP. "You stabbed Stephen Timms?" "Yep." Love the nonchalance about it. Why? She says she made an appointment to see him. "Why did you make that appointment?" "So I can do what I did." "So tell me what thought process you went through before you made that phone call." "I thought that it's not right that he voted for the declaration of war in Iraq." "What led you to start thinking about that?" "I've been learning about Islam." "Where have you been learning that?" "Internet." "What websites have you been looking at?" "I've been listening to lectures by Anwar al-Awlaki." "And where have you been listening to these lectures?" "I downloaded it off the internet." So she listened to a couple of hundred of these sermons, gets a knife, starts hacking away at her MP. These videos, like, by the way, all the videos starring Osama bin Laden, are cached forever. So the problem is, killing al-Awlaki doesn't solve this portion of the problem. And as I said, there's an entire dark web out there that's, at this point, enormous. Almost every terrorist group of any size has at least one website. Larger terrorist groups have their own media production and distribution companies. Most observers believe that the point of most attacks in Iraq was not to influence the war in any direct way, they had no hope of doing that, but to provide material that could be filmed. How important was that? During the surge in Iraq, American forces were able to capture a series of media labs. These were fairly sophisticated standalone laboratories, not guy with a laptop. They got 8 labs, and in those labs they found 23 terabytes of material waiting to be uploaded to the web. Now, these groups continually improved their material in terms of sophistication and quality. Now, let me note before I show you some clips, all of these were developed for the viewing experience of someone looking at a laptop. So automatically, by virtue of throwing them up onto a big screen, the viewing experience is degraded. They get fuzzier, the detail is worse, and so forth. So just keep that in mind when I show them to you. Also keep in mind I've stripped the audio tracks of most of these so that we can focus on the visuals as we go through them. Now, Al-Shabaab is Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia. In terms of media production, they're not all that together. They've got cameras and not much else. Somebody, somewhere, is working on their behalf, periodically putting out fairly sophisticated and long videos. Take a look at the graphics that they are using to introduce their videos when they put them out. Now, this is not done with a guy and a laptop. This takes a full-up media lab to do something this sophisticated. Now, to be sure, few videos have special effects that are that sophisticated. So let me give you an example that's a bit more representative and which also demonstrates the type of media influences that work on some of these groups. Because this clip is clearly derivative of one of the great classics of American cinema. Now, there are certain categories, themes, if you will, that repeat over and over. One type of video that you see a lot of is terrorists training little kids. Let me show you a shortcut from one very high-quality example of that genre. And watch the kids in the back row, how intent they are and how young they are. And you see their reaction when the race is over. And there are kids a lot younger than that on that video, by the way. Now, I mentioned a bit ago Shabab, the Somali group. Their key propagandist is this guy. He is known as Al-Amriki, the American, because he's an American. He grew up in Alabama, and he raps on his videos in perfect English. Here's another use of kids from one of the most famous of their videos. Look at me, I'm a jihadi warrior. Look at me, I'm having a good time. Do 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 do. But wait, he's not actually a jihadi warrior. He's the dream of a small toddler. The argument's pretty clear. Even our smallest children dream of jihad. Another category honors the movement's martyrs. And I'm going to give you a few seconds here of audio just to give you a sense of how compelling it can be, even when it's in a language that you don't speak.
Müjdeler olsun, müjdeler olsun, Allah'a itaat eden kullara. Müjdeler olsun, müjdeler olsun.
Okay, and I only gave you a few seconds of that because otherwise you'd be walking around all day going, which my classes are mad at me all the time because of that one. The final category, of course, is simply attacks, and this is an example of the type of video that I call a mashup.
All your base are belong to us.
And so that is my quick survey of the dark side of the web. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I would very much like to thank our panelists for coming out. Dr. Akoff, Dr. Dauber, Mr. Bedingfield, appreciate it. We'll take about a 30-minute break, and we will start with our second panel. Thank you.